The interstellar educational vessel Galactic Inquirer glided silently into Earth's orbit, its iridescent hull reflecting the blue-green planet below. Inside the ship's main observation deck, Professor Kravex adjusted his 6 limbs into what his species considered a comfortable lecturing posture. His massive scorpion-like exoskeleton clicked softly as he addressed the 10 students gathered before him. "Welcome to Earth, class," Professor Kravex announced, his mandibles clacking rhythmically to form the universal translator's words. "Today marks the beginning of your field research on why this seemingly innocuous planet has earned the designation Deathworld Class 13 in our galactic classification system." The students, a diverse collection of extraterrestrial beings, buzzed, hummed, and gurgled with excitement. They represented some of the most prestigious species in the Galactic Academy of Biology, each selected for this rare opportunity to study Earth firsthand. ZYX, a gaseous entity contained within a floating pressure suit, vibrated with anticipation. "Professor, I've studied the preliminary data. Surely the Class 13 designation is exaggerated? The dominant species appears relatively fragile." Professor Kravex's compound eyes glinted with what might have been amusement. "An excellent hypothesis, ZYX. Perhaps you'd care to test it immediately?" Without waiting for a response, he tapped a series of commands into the ship's control panel. "I'm disabling the gravitational compensators in 3, 2, 1. The change was instantaneous and catastrophic. ZYX's containment suit plummeted to the floor with a metallic clang. Blorb, a gelatinous student with no solid skeletal structure, began to spread across the deck in a viscous puddle. Xanther, the crystalline being from the Andromeda Galaxy, emitted a high-pitched whine as microfractures formed across its surface. "What's happening?" shrieked Quivix, a four-headed arthropod who was now lying flat on the ground, unable to lift even one of his heads. "Earth gravity," Professor Kravex replied, standing perfectly steady on his 8 powerful legs. "Approximately 3 times stronger than the standard we maintain on this vessel. I've spent decades adapting my physiology for this field trip. You, however, have not." "I'm melting," burbled Blorb. "More accurately, you're experiencing rapid gravitational compression," corrected the professor, making notes on his datapad. "Fascinating response. Do continue." After exactly 30 seconds, which felt like a minor eternity to the suffering students, Professor Kravex reactivated the gravity compensators. The relief in the room was palpable as bodies reformed, limbs lifted, and breathing apparatuses resumed normal function. "Consider that your first lesson," the professor stated, mandibles forming what passed for a smile in his species. "And perhaps the gentlest one you'll receive on this expedition. What you just experienced is merely the background condition of this planet, the canvas upon which all other deadly features are painted. But the humans," began ZYX, whose gaseous form was still reorganizing itself. "Evolved here, yes," finished Professor Kravex. "A fact that alone should give you pause. Anything that could evolve under these conditions must necessarily be resilient in ways we can scarcely comprehend." He pulled up a holographic display showing their landing coordinates. "We'll be conducting our field research in 3 distinct biomes, each highlighting different aspects of Earth's deadliness. First, the arid desert regions. Then, the tropical rainforest. Finally, human urban settlements." "Will we be making contact with the humans?" asked Tritox, a student whose body consisted of millions of microscopic organisms working in concert. "Strictly observational only," the professor replied firmly. "The last research team that attempted direct contact, well, let's just say their conclusions were filed in our tragic yet avoidable outcomes database." The students exchanged nervous glances, or in the case of Gasper, a methane-based life form, anxious bubble formations. "Now," continued Professor Kravex, "we'll descend to our first research site in approximately 6 Earth hours. I suggest you all review the safety protocols and prepare your environmental protection suits. Remember, nothing on this planet is as harmless as it appears." As the students dispersed to make preparations, Professor Kravex turned to gaze at the rotating planet below. Deathworld Class 13, he muttered to himself, and they still don't truly understand why. The landing module touched down in the heart of what Earth's inhabitants called the Arizona Desert. With the security shields lowered, the stark landscape stretched before the alien research team. Endless sand and rock formations under a brutally blue sky, punctuated by the occasional spiny vegetation. Current temperature, announced Professor Kravex, consulting his instruments, is 42 degrees Celsius. Local time is noon. Note that in approximately 6 hours after the sun sets, this same location will drop to near freezing temperatures. Temperature variance of nearly 50 degrees in a single-day cycle. Xanther's crystalline structure vibrated with concern. How does anything survive such extremes? An excellent question, nodded the professor. One I hope to see you answer in your research papers. Now, let's begin our sample collection. The students activated their protective suits and stepped cautiously onto the scorching sand. Each carried specialized equipment for gathering data on the environment and its life forms. Only 3 minutes into their expedition, Gasper's containment suit began to emit warning signals. Professor, my external sensors are detecting microscopic particles infiltrating my suit's filters. Professor Kravex scuttled over quickly. Sand and dust, abrasive enough to damage machinery and lungs alike. Fascinating defense mechanism for a seemingly inert substance, wouldn't you agree? Before Gasper could respond, a gust of wind swept through the canyon, carrying a cloud of fine dust. The particles swirled around them, finding their way into every crevice and joint of their protection suits. Gasper, whose methane-based biology allowed him to absorb moisture and particulates from the atmosphere, began to swell alarmingly. I'm absorbing too much. I can't. The rest of his sentence was lost as his containment suit expanded like a balloon and then burst with a resounding pop, sending fragments scattering across the desert floor. The other students froze in horror. Professor Kravex calmly collected a sample of Gasper's dispersing essence. He'll reconstitute in approximately 3 standard days, once we get him back to the proper atmospheric conditions on the ship. He made a notation on his datapad. First casualty at exactly 7 minutes and 22 seconds. Somewhat longer than I expected. You expected this. Tritox's collective organisms fluttered with agitation. I expected something, corrected the professor. Earth rarely disappoints in that regard. Now, shall we continue? As they ventured further into the desert, Xanther paused to examine one of the spiny plants dotting the landscape. This vegetation has evolved mechanical weaponry. The crystalline being observed, reaching out a faceted appendage toward what humans call the cactus. I wouldn't, Professor Kravex began, but it was too late. The moment Xanther's appendage made contact with the cactus, thousands of microscopic spines embedded themselves in the crystalline surface. What followed was an unexpected chemical reaction. The organic compounds in the spines interacting with Xanther's silicon-based biology. Hairline fractures spread rapidly across Xanther's form. It burns. Xanther vibrated in distress. The plant is dissolving me. Professor Kravex sprayed a neutralizing solution over the affected area. Not dissolving precisely. The plant's defenses contain compounds that catalyze a transformation in your molecular structure. Quite ingenious, really. He helped Xanther back toward the landing module. You'll need immediate medical attention. The ship's physicians should be able to stabilize your lattice structure. By the time they returned to the landing module, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, and the temperature was dropping precipitously. Quivix, whose four-headed body regulated temperature through external air sacs, began to shiver violently. PP Professor, all 4 mouths chattered simultaneously. My thermal regulation is failing. Yes, the rapid temperature fluctuation can be quite shocking, Professor Kravex agreed. Notice how even the rocks are cracking from the thermal stress. On Earth, even the geological features are in a constant state of destruction and reformation. As darkness fell completely, bringing temperatures below freezing, the remaining students huddled in the landing module, while Professor Kravex reviewed the day's findings. 2 serious injuries and numerous minor ones, he summarized. And we've only experienced one biome for less than a full Earth day cycle. Tomorrow, we proceed to the Amazon rainforest. I suggest you all reinforce your protection suits and perhaps reconsider your commitment to xenobiology as a career path. The students exchanged worried glances. None had expected Earth to be quite so immediately perilous. Even ZYX, normally the most confident of the group, had fallen unusually silent after watching a seemingly harmless Earth butterfly dissolve a portion of his containment suit with a single landing. The Amazon rainforest presented an entirely different category of threats. As the landing module descended through the thick canopy, the students gazed in awe at the riot of green life that surrounded them. 80% humidity, 38 degrees Celsius, and approximately 50,000 different species within scanning range, Professor Kravex announced. Earth's biodiversity reaches its peak in environments like this. As the hatch opened, the rich, organic scents of the rainforest wafted into the module. What the aliens couldn't identify was the distinctive smell of danger. Remember, cautioned the professor as they prepared to disembark. In this environment, everything is simultaneously predator and prey. The competition for survival has created evolutionary arms races resulting in some of the most sophisticated biological weapons in the galaxy. They ventured into the dense undergrowth, instruments humming as they collected data. The cacophony of sounds, birds calling, insects buzzing, distant animals howling, created a backdrop of constant sensory information. Plune, a student whose body consisted of hundreds of thin, whip-like tentacles, was the first to encounter the forest defenders. A swarm of mosquitoes, attracted by the unusual heat signature emanating from Plune's protective suit, descended upon the alien. The tiny insects managed to find microscopic weaknesses in the suit structure, inserting their proboscises through the seams. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Plune's tentacles began to swell and turn an alarming shade of purple. Something's injecting toxins into my circulatory system. Plune's voice modulator wailed. Fascinating, Professor Kravex observed, capturing one of the mosquitoes in a specimen container. These minuscule creatures have evolved the ability to inject anticoagulants and anesthetic compounds simultaneously, allowing them to extract nutrients without detection until it's too late. But why am I turning purple? Plune's voice had risen several octaves. That would be the histamine reaction. Your body is attempting to neutralize the foreign compounds. An impressive defense mechanism, but clearly incompatible with mosquito venom. The professor administered an anti-inflammatory injection. You'll need to return to the ship for a complete blood filtration. No sooner had Plune been evacuated than the remaining students encountered a new threat. A line of leafcutter ants was marching across their path, each insect carrying a piece of leaf many times its size. Observe the cooperative behavior, Professor Kravex pointed out. These creatures function as a superorganism, much like our colleague Tritox. Tritox leaned closer to observe the similarities, unwittingly disrupting the ants' chemical trail. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Hundreds of soldier ants broke formation and swarmed on a Tritox's protective suit. Within seconds, they had located the breathing apparatus and begun secreting corrosive compounds that quickly dissolved the filtration unit. My components are being invaded. Tritox's normally harmonious voice fractured into a discordant chorus as the microorganisms that comprised his body began to panic independently. Professor Kravex quickly activated an ultrasonic repeller that drove the ants away, but the damage was done. Tritox's collective was in disarray, with numerous individual organisms contaminated by the ants' chemical defenses. Back to the ship, ordered the professor. Tritox requires immediate quarantine and microbial stabilization. The remaining students were becoming visibly anxious. Blorb's gelatinous form had contracted to half its normal size in what appeared to be a stress response. Even ZYX's gaseous components were swirling in patterns that indicated extreme agitation. Perhaps this is enough research in this biome, suggested Vexilin, a student with an exoskeleton similar to Professor Kravex's, but considerably less robust. We've barely begun to catalog the threats, Professor Kravex replied. But I suppose we should move to higher ground. The afternoon rains will be starting soon, and you really don't want to experience what that does to the local fungal spore count. As if on cue, a distant rumble of thunder echoed through the forest. The group hurried toward a rocky outcropping, seeking shelter from the impending downpour. They had almost reached safety when Zwiax's containment suit snagged on a seemingly innocuous vine. The plant, sensing the disturbance, released a cloud of spores directly into a microscopic tear in the suit. Contamination alert. Zwiax's communication system blared. Inside the suit, the gaseous entity began to solidify as the fungal spores catalyzed an unprecedented chemical reaction. Zwiax is crystallizing, Vexilin reported in alarm. Professor Kravex examined the rapidly hardening gas cloud inside the containment suit. Indeed, these particular spores have evolved to immobilize prey for later consumption by converting gaseous elements into solid compounds. Quite ingenious. Can you help them? Blore bubbled anxiously. The ship's medical team will need to create a specialized solvent, the professor replied. For now, we must get Zwiax back to the landing module before the transformation completes. As they carried their increasingly solid colleague back through the forest, a troop of capuchin monkeys descended from the canopy. One of the more curious primates approached Vexilin and, with surprising dexterity, detached the breathing apparatus from his suit. My respiratory support. Vexilin clicked in panic. The monkey, seemingly delighted with its new toy, clambered higher into the trees, examining the device with intelligent eyes. It's smiling at me. Vexilin's mandibles clattered with increasing distress. It's showing its teeth in what humans call a friendly expression, but it has stolen my life support. Yes, the juxtaposition of apparent friendliness and lethal behavior is quite common among Earth species, Professor Kravex noted, particularly the primates, who share certain psychological traits with humans. The professor raised his multi-spectrum scanner toward the monkey. I'd advise against pursuing it. That particular species has been known to throw excrement when threatened. By the time they reached the landing module, heavy rain was pounding the forest canopy. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of organic matter rapidly decomposing in the heat. Inside the safety of the module, Professor Kravex conducted a damage assessment. For serious injuries requiring immediate medical attention, he tallied, plus countless minor abrasions, toxin exposures, and psychological trauma. And we've explored less than 1 square kilometer of one forest on one continent. Ow! Blore gurgled weakly. Do humans survive here? An excellent question, the professor replied. One will be investigating in our final research site, a human urban center. The human settlement known as Miami, Florida, sprawled below their observation vessel. Gleaming buildings, roadways packed with vehicles, and thousands of humans going about their daily activities. We've entered what humans consider a developed area, Professor Kravex explained. Though by galactic standards, their technology remains primitive. Notice how they still rely on combustion engines and physical transportation rather than molecular teleportation. The remaining students, now only 5 of the original 10 were still fit for field research, observed the bustling city with trepidation. After their experiences in the desert and rainforest, they had developed a healthy respect for Earth's dangers. Surely here, among their own constructions, they must have eliminated the more lethal aspects of their environment. Ventured Blorb, who had partially recovered but still showed signs of stress in the unusual viscosity of his outer membrane. One might think so, the professor replied. Yet observe. He directed their attention to a particular section of the city, zooming in with the ship's visual array. A human was standing on the edge of a tall building, secured by what appeared to be an inadequate rope. What are they doing? Vexilin asked, his mandibles clicking rapidly in distress. Preparing to jump, Professor Kravex replied matter-of-factly. The students watched in horror as the human did exactly that, plummeting toward the ground before the rope caught and elastically rebounded. Bungee jumping, the professor explained. A recreational activity. Recreation? Blorb's entire form rippled with incomprehension. They willingly simulate a near-death experience for pleasure. Indeed, and it's one of their tamer pastimes. Professor Kravex shifted the view screen to a coastal area where humans on small boards were being propelled along massive waves, occasionally being submerged beneath tons of water. Surfing, he identified. Note that many of these water bodies contain predatory organisms capable of severing limbs with a single bite. The observational tour continued, with the professor highlighting increasingly baffling human behaviors. Individuals ingesting substances known to be toxic for the sensation it produced, others deliberately exposing themselves to harmful radiation to alter their skin pigmentation, groups gathering to watch other humans deliberately crash vehicles into each other at high speeds. But this defies all evolutionary logic, protested Vexilin. Species should develop behaviors that enhance survival, not jeopardize it. Unless, Professor Kravex posited, the ability to confront and even seek out danger provides some evolutionary advantage we've yet to comprehend. The view screen shifted again, this time focusing on what appeared to be a human dwelling with a small artificial water body behind it. Observe this typical scene in this region, the professor instructed. A human emerged from the dwelling carrying a small container. They approached the water's edge, knelt down, and began to sprinkle something onto the surface. Within moments, a large reptilian creature emerged from the water, what the students recognized from their studies as an alligator. The human is feeding one of the planet's apex predators, Vexilin observed with mounting alarm, one that has remained virtually unchanged for millions of years due to its evolutionary perfection as a killing machine. Actually, corrected Professor Kravex, according to the ship's cultural database, this particular human refers to this specimen as Snappy and considers it a pet. The students watched in stunned silence as the human reached out to pat the alligator's armored head. But that's, Blore began. Suicidal? Deranged? By our standards, yes, the professor agreed. By human standards, it's what they call Tuesday. He brought up a news feed showing various human activities across the region labeled as Florida Man. This particular geographic area is noted even among humans for extreme behaviors, Professor Kravex explained. Though I should note that what they consider extreme varies only by degree, not kind. The feed displayed humans wrestling large serpents, installing explosive devices for celebration purposes, consuming potentially lethal amounts of fermented grain products, and intentionally provoking organisms with well-documented defensive capabilities. Surely this is some form of entertainment production? Vexilin suggested hopefully. A simulation for tourism purposes? I'm afraid not, the professor replied. This is, as humans say, just another Wednesday. The view screen shifted to a desert region where humans were voluntarily gathering in conditions the students had found nearly lethal. This annual gathering is called Burning Man, Professor Kravex explained. Humans travel to one of the most inhospitable regions of their planet to intentionally experience dehydration, exposure to toxic dust, sleep deprivation, and extremes of temperature. For what purpose? Asked Blorb, genuinely perplexed. They call it fun, the professor replied, though there appears to be a philosophical component involving temporary community formation and artistic expression. The view screen showed humans consuming spiced foods that caused visible pain, riding wheeled devices down near vertical inclines, and deliberately jumping from aircraft with only thin fabric canopies to slow their descent. One by one, the remaining students activated their withdrawal request interfaces. Professor Kravex watched without comment as they formally requested to be removed from the course. I believe I've seen enough to complete my thesis, Vexilin stated, mandibles clicking rapidly in what his species recognized as extreme anxiety. As have I, agreed Blorb, whose normally translucent form had become completely opaque, a stress response unique to his species. Professor Kravex nodded. As you wish. But before we depart, I have one final observation to share. He shifted the view screen to a laboratory setting where humans in protective clothing were gathered around a containment vessel. This is a current research project at one of their scientific institutions, the professor explained. They are attempting to create artificial intelligence capable of surpassing their own cognitive abilities. They're intentionally creating entities that could potentially outthink and replace them. Vexelin's voice had risen to a near screech. Precisely, confirmed Professor Kravex. While simultaneously developing weapons capable of planetary destruction, modifying their own genome, and deliberately altering their planet's climate through industrial activity. There was a moment of stunned silence, broken only by a strange popping sound. The group turned to see one of the few remaining students, a small, multi-eyed being named Plex, literally exploding from neural overload, sending tiny phosphorescent particles floating throughout the observation deck. That's the first time I've seen a Zerillion experience spontaneous cognitive rupture, Professor Kravex noted clinically, collecting a sample of the glowing particles. Another excellent data point for our research. He turned to the remaining students. Now, would anyone like to volunteer for additional field research? Perhaps a doctoral thesis on human psychology? The collective recoil was answer enough. Back aboard the main vessel, safely beyond Earth's gravitational pull, the surviving students gathered in the medical bay. Most were still undergoing treatments for various Earth-induced traumas, both physical and psychological. I believe, Professor Kravex announced as he entered the bay, that you've all gained valuable insights from this expedition. Insights? Vexelin's mandibles clicked weakly. Professor, with all due respect, 7 of us experienced life-threatening injuries. Plex literally exploded. Plex will reconstitute in approximately 17 days. The professor waved a dismissive claw. And the medical team assures me that everyone else will make a full recovery. Physically, at least. He activated a holographic display showing Earth rotating slowly. More importantly, you've experienced firsthand what makes Earth unique in our galactic classification system. It's not merely the environmental hazards, impressive though they are. It's not even the astonishing biodiversity, with its myriad toxic, venomous, and predatory species. It's the humans, Blore bubbled softly. Precisely. Professor Kravex's mandibles formed what passed for a smile among his species. Earth's dominant species doesn't simply survive on a death world. They actively embrace its deadliness. They seek out danger. They deliberately expose themselves to harm for recreation. They create new risks when natural ones prove insufficient. He zoomed the display to show humans engaged in various activities, climbing sheer cliff faces without protective equipment, diving into underwater caves, consuming foods known to be potentially toxic. Their physiology is remarkably fragile, the professor continued. Their bones break easily. Their skin tears. They lack natural armor, venom, significant speed, or strength. By all logical measures, they should have been extinct millions of years ago. Yet they dominate their planet, Vexelin noted. More than that, Professor Kravex corrected. They've begun exploring beyond it. Their primitive spacecraft have already visited neighboring worlds. They've sent probes to the edges of their solar system. The professor's compound eyes glinted with something approaching admiration. Which leads me to question whether their seemingly irrational behaviors, their constant risk-taking, their curiosity about potentially lethal unknowns, their ability to find enjoyment in conditions most species would find traumatic, represents not an evolutionary flaw, but perhaps the ultimate adaptation. You can't be suggesting we should emulate them? Blorb's form rippled with alarm. Certainly not. The professor clicked his mandibles dismissively. But I'm suggesting that their unique psychology merits further study. Their bodies may be weak, but their minds make me question whether they represent evolved intelligence or organized insanity. The students contemplated this in silence, each processing their experiences on the deadly blue planet below. I have one final task for those of you still capable of academic work, Professor Kravex announced. A brief reflection on what you've learned from this expedition. Hours later, as the ship prepared to enter hyperspace, the professor reviewed their submissions. One passage, written by Vexilin, particularly caught his attention. Humans do not merely exist on a death world. They have mastered it through sheer, unconscious recklessness. Their evolutionary path has favored not physical supremacy, but psychological adaptation to constant danger. They do not flee from death. They invite it to dinner, then dare it to a game of chance. A game they somehow, against all probability, frequently win. This planet should be quarantined, Blorb had appended to his own submission. For the safety of all galactic citizens. Professor Kravex allowed himself a small, private chuckle as he entered the final coordinates for their return journey. Too late for that, he murmured to himself. They already have 2 seats on the Galactic Council. As the stars stretched into luminous streaks outside the viewports, he added a personal note to the official expedition record. In retrospect, the Deathworld Class 13 designation applied to Earth may be inadequate. It fails to capture the planet's most remarkable feature, that its dominant species has rendered the classification meaningless through their incomprehensible relationship with mortality. They do not fear death, they flirt with it. And somehow, in that perilous dance, they have found the key to their unlikely success. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Perhaps we should fear them. Perhaps we should admire them. But we most certainly should watch them very, very closely. With a final command, the ship accelerated beyond light speed, leaving Earth behind. A small blood, harboring dangers beyond most alien comprehension, and a species whose greatest strength might be their embrace of what any rational being would flee. A death world indeed. But perhaps, Professor Kravex mused, that was precisely the crucible needed to forge something truly extraordinary in the cosmos.